A man who controlled entire city blocks felt his hands shake at the sight of a woman in thrift store clothes. Sun Woo-hyun had ordered executions with less emotion than he felt watching her cross a Manhattan street. The boy wrapped in her arms looked back at him, not with curiosity, but with recognition, and something ancient shifted in Woo-hyun's chest. His security detail noticed the pause. In his world, hesitation was confession. Across the cracked pavement, Nia Jackson's body stiffened, her arms tightening around the child, as if she could feel the danger radiating from the black SUVs. She didn't run. She didn't speak. She simply turned, placing herself between Woo-hyun and the boy, and for the first time in 15 years, the most dangerous man in New York felt powerless. The street had just revealed a secret that could destroy everything he'd built, or everything he'd abandoned. This story will change how you see power, sacrifice, and what it means to be a father. Subscribe and comment where you're watching from. Now let's begin. Sun Woo-hyun did not walk through the city. The city parted for him. Black vehicles slowed at intersections before his convoy arrived. Pedestrians found reasons to study their phones when his shadow passed storefront windows. Conversations softened to whispers in restaurants where he'd reserved tables that never appeared on any list. Manhattan bent quietly to men like him, men whose names were never spoken aloud in public spaces, only understood in the grammar of fear and respect that governed the invisible economy of power. He stepped out of the lead SUV onto West 47th Street, his suit cut with the precision of a man who understood that presentation was the first language of control. The fabric didn't wrinkle. The tie didn't shift. Even his breath seemed measured, as if he'd learned to regulate the autonomic functions that made other men vulnerable to observation. This was supposed to be routine. Another acquisition meeting. Another controlled outcome in a life built from controlled outcomes. Then the street betrayed him. Across the road, between buildings that leaned toward each other like exhausted soldiers, a woman stood perfectly still in the kind of stillness that comes from counting exits and weighing risks. She wore a canvas jacket 2 sizes too large, its hem frayed from use rather than design. Her jeans had been mended at the knee with thread that didn't quite match. The boy pressed against her side couldn't have been more than 7. His small hands gripping fabric that had been washed thin. Nia Jackson. The name arrived in Woo-hyun's mind like a gunshot. Sudden, irreversible, and accompanied by the metallic taste of adrenaline. She was smaller than memory suggested, or perhaps memory had preserved her in the context of better days, when she'd worn dresses that caught light and laughed at things that seemed impossibly distant now. Her hair was pulled back in a style chosen for function, not beauty. Her face carried the particular exhaustion of someone who'd learned that rest was a luxury she couldn't afford. But it was her posture that stopped his breath. Defensive, vigilant, the stance of someone who'd been protecting something precious for so long that the muscles had memorized the geometry of guardianship. His driver shifted in the front seat. His lead security officer's hand moved fractionally toward his jacket. They'd seen it. The pause. The break-in pattern. In Woo-hyun's world, patterns were religion, and deviation was heresy. The boy looked at him then. Really looked, with dark eyes that held none of the wariness children usually showed around men in expensive suits flanked by armed personnel. Those eyes didn't dart away or seek permission from the woman who held him. They simply held steady, examining Woo-hyun's face with the unsettling focus of someone solving a puzzle they didn't know they'd been given. And in that moment, Sun Woo-hyun, who'd built an empire on the principle that emotion was weakness and sentiment was suicide, felt the foundations of his carefully constructed world begin to crack. Because the boy didn't just see him. The boy recognized him. The child tilted his head with the slow deliberation of someone studying their own reflection in unfamiliar glass. Not curiosity, not fear, something older than both. Woo-hyun had spent 2 decades reading men's faces across negotiation tables and interrogation rooms, cataloging the micro-expressions that preceded lies or violence or surrender. He knew how to interpret the dilation of pupils, the tension in jaw muscles, the involuntary swallow that betrayed weakness. This boy's face showed none of that. Instead, the child looked at him the way compass needles find north, automatic, inevitable, pulled by forces that required no conscious thought. Those dark eyes held the same steady assessment Woo Hyun saw in his own mirror each morning. The expression of someone who'd learned early that the world sorted itself into threats and non-threats, and everything else was decoration. The boy's small hand released its grip on Nia's jacket. Just slightly. Just enough. As if he'd found something he'd been waiting for. The recognition hit Woo Hyun like a blade between ribs, sharp, cold, and accompanied by the nauseating certainty that this wound wouldn't close cleanly. His breath caught in his chest. His pulse hammered against his collar. Somewhere in his autonomic nervous system, ancient survival mechanisms fired warnings his conscious mind was still processing. Blood knows blood. The thought arrived without permission, bypassing logic entirely. No DNA test. No birth certificate. No mathematical calculation of timelines and possibilities. Just the animal certainty that occurs in marrow and muscle before the brain can construct rational explanations. Nia noticed. Her body language shifted instantly. Shoulders squaring, weight redistributing, head turning just enough to place herself more fully between Woo Hyun and the boy. The movement was practiced, instinctive, the kind of positioning that comes from years of standing between something precious and everything that wants to take it. She didn't look at Woo Hyun directly. Didn't acknowledge him, didn't speak, but her hand found the boy's shoulder with the sureness of someone executing a rehearsed protocol. The touch said everything words couldn't. We're leaving. Now, don't look back. The boy resisted for one heartbeat longer than obedience required. His eyes remained locked on Woo Hyun's face, searching for something children shouldn't need to search for. Confirmation, maybe, or permission. Or simply the answer to a question he'd been too young to articulate but old enough to feel in the empty spaces of his small life. Then Nia's hand tightened, gentle but absolute, and the boy allowed himself to be turned away. They moved toward the alley's mouth with the practiced efficiency of people who'd disappeared before. No running. No panique. Just purposeful motion that wouldn't draw attention from anyone who wasn't already watching. Woo Hyun stood motionless on the curb, his body refusing commands from a mind that had suddenly lost all authority. Behind him, his driver cleared his throat softly. A sound that meant, "Sir, we're exposed," in the coded language of men who protected other men for money. But Woo Hyun couldn't move, because he'd just seen his own eyes looking back at him from a face that shouldn't exist. And he understood, with the terrible clarity that precedes irreversible choices, that the boy hadn't just recognized him. The boy had been waiting. Woo Hyun's lead security officer, Kim Jin-ho, had worked close protection for 11 years. He'd learned to read his principal's body language the way cardiac surgeons read EKGs, monitoring for the subtle irregularities that preceded catastrophic failure. The pause had lasted 7 seconds. In their world, 7 seconds was a confession. Jin-ho's eyes tracked the woman and child as they disappeared into the alley's shadow, his peripheral vision simultaneously cataloging the faces of nearby pedestrians, the angles of surrounding windows, the positions of potential threats. His hand stayed near his weapon, not from external danger, but from the sudden unpredictability of the man he was paid to protect. Behind them, the second vehicle's occupants had already noticed. Park Min-suk, Woo Hyun's deputy for financial operations, leaned forward in his seat, his gaze following the same trajectory Jin-ho's had traced. His phone stayed in his pocket, but his expression performed calculations that required no digital assistance. In the organizational structure that governed their lives, information was currency, and unexpected information was worth even more. The driver broke protocol first, his voice carefully neutral. "Sir, shall we proceed to the meeting?" It was a tactical question, a rescue line, an opportunity to pretend the last 7 seconds hadn't fractured the careful facade Woo Hyun had maintained for 2 decades. Woo Hyun nodded once, too slowly, too deliberately, like a man operating machinery he'd suddenly forgotten how to control. They entered the building 12 minutes late. 12 minutes was unthinkable. Woo Hyun didn't arrive late to meetings, didn't lose track of time, didn't allow personal disruptions to interfere with professional obligations. His reputation had been built on the absolute reliability of his presence, the predictability of his precision. Lateness was vulnerability. Vulnerability was blood in the water. The meeting proceeded with surface normalcy. Contracts signed, terms negotiated, agreements sealed with the formal courtesy that characterized transactions between men who understood that civilization was a performance they maintained for mutual benefit. But Woo Hyun's attention fractured across multiple registers simultaneously. He heard himself speak, watched his hands move documents, observed his face maintain appropriate expressions. But his mind remained 7 seconds behind, replaying the boy's steady gaze. Park Min-suk noticed everything. He sat 3 chairs down, his posture relaxed, his expression attentive to the negotiations unfolding across the conference table. But his eyes performed their own calculations, measuring the spaces between Woo Hyun's words, weighing the slight delay in his responses, cataloging the 1,000 micro-adjustments that signaled distraction in a man who'd never been distracted before. Min-suk had built his career on reading the invisible currents that moved through power structures. He understood that organizations were living systems, and living systems responded to changes in their apex predators. Weakness at the top created opportunity below. Hesitation invited challenge. Distraction opened windows that closed as quickly as they appeared. He didn't ask questions. Questions created evidence. Instead, he filed observations in the mental ledger he maintained on everyone who mattered. The woman, the child, the pause, the unprecedented lateness. Each data point formed part of a pattern he couldn't yet interpret but wouldn't forget. In the SUV afterward, Jin-ho broke silence with characteristic directness. Do you require additional security protocols? It was the closest thing to an accusation he could make. The professional translation was clear. You've exposed yourself to something. Tell me what I'm protecting you from. No, Woo Hyun said. The word came out harder than intended, carrying the weight of commands that didn't tolerate questioning. Jin-ho nodded once and said nothing else. But his eyes found the rearview mirror, and in that reflection, Woo Hyun saw what he'd spent 11 years preventing anyone from seeing. Doubt about whether the man giving orders was still thinking clearly enough to survive the consequences of his own decisions. 30 blocks away, Min-suk made a single phone call to someone who specialized in finding people who didn't want to be found. He didn't mention Woo Hyun's name. He didn't need to. Woo Hyun returned to his penthouse alone, dismissing his security detail at the private elevator with a gesture that invited no discussion. The space greeted him with the sterile perfection of places designed to impress rather than comfort. Marble that reflected nothing, furniture positioned with geometric precision, windows that framed the city like a possession he'd already conquered. He poured whiskey he didn't drink and stood at the glass, watching Manhattan arrange itself into patterns of light and shadow, and remembered the woman who'd wanted none of this. Nia had laughed easily then, in the years before he'd taught her that laughter was a luxury people like him couldn't afford to keep near them. She'd worked at a community center in Brooklyn, teaching art to children whose parents worked 3 jobs and still came up short. She believed in mornings, in peace, in the possibility of places untouched by men whose phones rang at 3 a.m. with problems that required bodies to disappear. What do you actually do? She'd asked on their 4th date, her voice carrying genuine curiosity rather than suspicion. Import-export, he'd said, which was true in the way that calling a hurricane weather patterns was technically accurate. She'd accepted the vagueness because she'd wanted to, because she'd seen something in him that he'd stopped seeing in himself, the capacity for gentleness, buried under layers of necessity and violence. They'd built something fragile in the spaces between his obligations. Late dinners when he could steal hours. Weekend mornings when his phone stayed silent. Conversations about futures that felt possible when she smiled at him like he was someone worth saving. I want windows, she'd said one Sunday, her head resting on his chest. A place with light. Maybe a small yard. Somewhere quiet enough to hear yourself think. He'd said nothing, his hand tracing patterns on her shoulder, while his mind calculated the impossibility of her dreams surviving contact with his reality. Quiet places made excellent ambush sites. Light through windows revealed positions to snipers. Yards provided no cover when rivals decided to send messages written in the language of collateral damage. She wanted peace. He dealt in consequences. The argument came on a Thursday in March, rain streaking the windows of her small apartment in Crown Heights, the kind of place where neighbors knew each other's names and children played on stoops without armed escorts. "You're never really here," she'd said, not angry yet, just tired. "Even when you're sitting right in front of me, you're calculating exits and checking sight lines and treating every moment like it might explode." "That's because it might," he'd said, the truth escaping before discipline could contain it. She'd gone very still then, her hand moving unconsciously to her stomach. A gesture so brief he almost missed it, so instinctive she probably didn't know she'd done it. "I'm pregnant," she'd said quietly, "and I want this child to grow up knowing what safety feels like." The words had hit him like shrapnel. Sharp, penetrating, impossible to extract cleanly. He'd looked at her then, really looked, and seen everything he couldn't protect. The curve of her cheek that would shatter under interrogation. The gentle hands that would break trying to shield a child from men who understood mercy as weakness. The hope in her eyes that would die slowly, poisoned by proximity to a man whose enemies collected leverage the way other people collected debts. "I can't give you that," he'd said. "Then give me the truth," she'd replied. "Tell me who you really are." But the truth would have made her complicit, made her a target, made her someone his enemies could use to break him in ways that bullets never could. So he'd lied through silence and left through cowardice, telling himself he was protecting her when he was really protecting himself from watching her die because of him. Now, standing in his sterile penthouse, Woo Hyun replayed that final moment, her hand on her stomach, her eyes searching his face for something he wouldn't give her. The boy's age aligned perfectly with the timeline. 7 years, give or take a few months. The math was simple. The implications were catastrophic. He'd left to keep her safe, and she'd raised his son alone in the kind of poverty that made people invisible, which was, he realized with devastating clarity, exactly the camouflage she'd needed. She hadn't failed. She'd survived. Without him. Nia Jackson woke at 5:47 a.m., 13 minutes before her alarm. In a studio apartment in Washington Heights that cost $1,100 a month. Cheap enough to pay in cash. Expensive enough to avoid buildings where landlords didn't ask questions because they already knew the answers. She listened first. Always first. The hallway outside. Footsteps, voices. The hydraulic sigh of the elevator. Normal morning sounds. The fire escape. Nothing unusual. The street below. Delivery trucks, early commuters. The rhythm of a city waking without urgency. Only then did she move. Eli slept on the pull-out couch, his breathing steady. One small hand curled near his face in the gesture he'd maintained since infancy. She watched him for 30 seconds. A ritual she'd performed every morning for 7 years, counting breaths, confirming existence, preparing herself for another day of keeping him alive. The apartment was sparse by necessity, not neglect. No family photographs on walls that landlords might remember. No documents in drawers that could be searched. No mail delivered to this address. Everything went to a P.O. box she checked on rotating schedules, never falling into patterns that made surveillance easy. She worked 3 jobs, none of which required background checks that dug too deep. Morning shifts at a laundromat in Inwood, where she counted quarters and folded strangers' clothes while Eli stayed with Mrs. Chun 2 floors down. A grandmother who asked no questions because Nia helped her with rent when Social Security came up short. Afternoon hours cleaning offices in Midtown, buildings large enough that security guards stopped remembering faces after the first week. She wore her hair different ways, changed her route to work, never used the same subway entrance twice in a row. Evening gigs doing data entry remotely, paid through platforms that reported to the IRS but didn't require meetings or video calls or explanations about why she needed to work from home after her son fell asleep. The money was always tight, deliberately tight. Wealth attracted attention. Comfort invited questions. Bank accounts over certain thresholds triggered automatic reports to agencies that shared databases with other agencies, creating digital trails that people with resources could follow. So she stayed small, stayed mobile, stayed forgotten. She'd never put a father's name on Eli's birth certificate, never applied for child support, never filed claims that would require his existence to be justified in systems designed to connect data points across institutional boundaries. When Eli started school, she'd chosen the largest public elementary in the district, overcrowded enough that teachers struggled to remember which parents belonged to which children, diverse enough that a black woman with a half-Korean son didn't trigger the pattern recognition algorithms that lived in people's unconscious assumptions. She taught him young. Don't tell people where you live. Don't talk about mom's work. Don't make friends with children whose parents ask too many questions. Don't ever mention that you don't have a father. Not because fathers were shameful, because the wrong father was dangerous. Eli had asked once, at 5 years old, his voice small in the darkness before sleep, "Why don't I have a dad?" She'd held him close and told him the truth she could afford. "Because I love you too much to share you with someone who couldn't keep you safe." He'd accepted this the way children accept mysteries that hurt too much to question. Now, preparing breakfast in their narrow kitchen, Nia heard Eli stir on the couch. His eyes opened, found her immediately. The same morning ritual, the confirmation that they'd both survived another night. "Morning, baby," she said softly. "Morning, Mom." He didn't ask about the man in the expensive suit, but she saw the question in his eyes, waiting. Across the city, Woo-hyun stared at reports his people had compiled overnight. Nia Jackson, age 34, 3 jobs, no credit cards, no social media presence, no digital footprint beyond the absolute minimum required to exist legally in a modern society. She hadn't fallen into poverty. She'd built it like a fortress. And he finally understood. She hadn't been hiding from the world. She'd been hiding from him. Woo-hyun didn't sleep. He sat in his office as the city's lights dimmed and dawn bled across the East River, surrounded by documents that confirmed what his body had already known on that street corner. The timeline was irrefutable. He'd left Nia in late March, 7 years and 8 months ago. The boy appeared to be 7, maybe slightly younger, the kind of age estimation that could shift a few months either direction depending on genetics and nutrition. March to December, 9 months. The math was elementary school simple. The implications were apocalyptic. He pulled up the background report his team had compiled, reading details that transformed poverty from circumstance into strategy. Nia had moved 4 times in 7 years, always staying within the same general area but never establishing patterns that made her predictable. She'd avoided hospitals for the birth, a midwife in Brooklyn paid in cash, no insurance claims, no electronic medical records that could be subpoenaed or hacked. She'd named the boy Eli, just Eli. No middle name that might hint at heritage. No surname that connected him to either parent definitively. She'd used Jackson, her own name, but hadn't listed a father. The birth certificate was a masterpiece of strategic omission. Woo-hyun understood what she'd done. Every choice, every sacrifice, every deliberate descent into invisibility. It was all armor. Protection built from absence, camouflage constructed from poverty, safety purchased through the kind of sacrifice that left no receipts. She'd known what he was, known what it meant. Known that the only way to keep their child alive was to ensure no one, including him, could find them easily. The realization fractured something fundamental in his chest. For 20 years, he'd built an empire on the principle that power was protection, that strength prevented vulnerability, that control was the only reliable defense against chaos. He'd convinced himself that leaving Nia was mercy, that distance was the kindness men like him owed to women who believed in windows and light. But she'd understood what he'd refused to acknowledge. Power didn't protect people. Power painted targets. And she'd spent 7 years keeping their son off the map while he'd spent 7 years pretending he'd made the noble choice. The guilt arrived without warning, bypassing the psychological defenses he'd constructed to survive in a world where sentiment was exploitable and emotion was ammunition. It filled his chest like water in drowning lungs. Heavy, suffocating, irreversible. He'd abandoned his son, not through malice, not through indifference, through the arrogant certainty that his absence was protection. And now every option ahead led to blood. Walk away, maintain the distance he'd convinced himself was safety, and leave Eli exposed to enemies who'd already started noticing the pause, the hesitation, the 7 seconds that had confessed everything his discipline had tried to hide. Step closer, acknowledge paternity, provide the resources and protection his name could command, and transform Eli from invisible child into visible heir. A target for every rival who understood that hurting sons was how you destroyed fathers. There was no clean exit, no strategic solution, no move that didn't end with someone dying. He opened his desk drawer and withdrew a photograph he'd kept hidden for 7 years, the only one he'd taken of Nia, captured on a Sunday morning when she'd been laughing at something he couldn't remember now. She looked impossibly young in the image, impossibly hopeful, her eyes reflecting a future she'd believed was possible. He'd stolen that future, and she'd built a new one anyway, alone in the kind of poverty that made people disappear. His phone buzzed. Jinho's name appeared on the screen with a message that required no elaboration. "We have a problem." Woo-hyun closed his eyes. The city had noticed. Questions were forming, and every question brought them closer to the boy. He'd spent 2 decades believing power was the answer to every problem. Now he understood it was the problem itself. Protection required invisibility, but invisibility required powerlessness. And he'd just destroyed both by pausing for 7 seconds on a Manhattan street. Jinho arrived within 20 minutes, his face carrying the expression of men delivering news that couldn't be unsaid. "Park Min-suk asked about the woman," he said without preamble. "Not directly, not to you, but he's been making inquiries through channels that don't report back to us." Woo-hyun's hands stilled on the desk. "What kind of inquiries?" "Surveillance footage from the street cameras. Traffic patterns. He's trying to identify which direction they went after entering the alley." Jinho paused, weighing his next words. "He hired an independent contractor. Someone who specializes in finding people who don't want to be found." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Min-suk was ambitious. Woo-hyun had always known this. Ambition was useful when properly directed, lethal when it identified weakness in the hierarchy above it. The pause on the street had been blood in the water. Now Min-suk was circling, testing whether the apex predator was injured enough to challenge. "Does he know about the boy?" Woo-hyun asked. "Not yet, but he knows there's something. And in our business, something is enough." Woo-hyun stood, moving to the window that framed Manhattan like a kingdom he'd spent 20 years conquering. Somewhere in that grid of lights and shadows, Nia was preparing for work, unaware that the fortress she'd built from poverty was about to be tested by men with resources that could penetrate any camouflage. "I want surveillance on her building," he said quietly. "Discreet. Nothing that draws attention. And I want to know everyone who asks questions about her or the boy. Everyone." Jinho nodded. "What about Min-suk?" "Let him look. For now." Woo-hyun turned from the window. "But make sure he doesn't find anything before we do." The protection protocols began that night. Not the obvious kind, no armed guards, no visible security presence that would announce importance and invite scrutiny. Instead, Woo-hyun deployed the invisible infrastructure that powerful men used when they needed to control spaces without occupying them. A sympathetic landlord suddenly found financing to upgrade building security. New cameras appeared, angled to cover approaches rather than hallways. The superintendent received an anonymous bonus for reporting any unusual visitors or questions about specific tenants. 3 rotating teams began watching Nia's building from positions that changed daily: coffee shops, delivery vehicles, occupied apartments across the street. They documented everyone who entered, every pattern that deviated from normal, every face that appeared more than coincidence would explain. Woo-hyun studied their reports with the obsessive focus of a man who understood he was playing defense with pieces he couldn't afford to lose. Nia maintained her routines with disciplined consistency. Work, home, school pickup, the small radius of movement that kept her world contained and predictable. She checked over her shoulder frequently, the habitual vigilance of someone who'd been watching for threats long before they materialized. She knew something was wrong. He could see it in the way she held Eli's hand tighter, the way her eyes scanned crowds with heightened attention, the way she varied her route home by subtle degrees each day. Maternal instinct was its own intelligence network, and hers was firing warnings. On the fourth day, Min-suk requested a meeting. He arrived at Woo Hyun's office with the casual confidence of men who believed they'd discovered leverage. His suit was expensive but not ostentatious, his manner respectful but not deferential, the careful calibration of someone testing boundaries. "I wanted to discuss the expansion into the Brooklyn ports," Min-suk said, settling into the chair across from Woo Hyun's desk. "We can discuss it at the scheduled meeting next week," Woo Hyun replied evenly. "Of course." Min-suk smiled. "I also wanted to mention, purely as a courtesy, that there's been some unusual activity in Washington Heights. Nothing concrete, just patterns that seemed worth noting." The room went very still. "What kind of patterns?" Woo Hyun asked, his voice carrying no inflection. "Questions being asked. People looking for information about someone you might have known." Casually. Min-suk's smile never wavered. "I thought you'd want to be aware." It wasn't a question. It was a chess piece moved into position. A declaration that the game had changed. Woo Hyun met his gaze with the flat calm of men who'd survived worse challenges than ambitious subordinates testing loyalty. "Thank you for the information," he said. "I'll handle it." Min-suk nodded and left, his posture carrying the satisfaction of someone who'd just confirmed his suspicions. After the door closed, Jin-ho emerged from the adjacent room where he'd been listening. "He knows," Jin-ho said simply. "Not yet," Woo Hyun corrected. "But he will soon." The clock had started ticking, and somewhere in Washington Heights, Eli was waking up for school, completely unaware that innocence had an expiration date, and his had just been noticed. Woo Hyun made the decision at 3 a.m., watching surveillance footage of Eli walking to school with his mother, the boy's small hand swallowed by hers. He would never approach them, never reveal himself, never claim the title he'd forfeited through cowardice 7 years ago. Instead, he would do what Nia had been doing alone. Build walls from shadows and buy time with silence. The extraction took 6 days to arrange. Not an extraction, really. That word implied force, visibility, the kind of dramatic intervention that left witnesses and evidence. What Woo Hyun orchestrated was closer to erosion. The gradual, invisible reshaping of circumstances until the path of least resistance led exactly where he needed it to go. A job offer arrived for Nia from a nonprofit in Portland, legitimate organization, real position, salary high enough to seem like opportunity without triggering suspicion. The offer came through proper channels, included references from people she'd actually worked with, looked exactly like the kind of lucky break that sometimes happened to people who'd been quietly competent for years. The apartment in Portland was arranged through a housing program for low-income families. Real program, real subsidies, nothing that suggested manipulation. Ground floor unit in a building with proper security, neighborhood with good schools, far enough from New York that Manhattan's memory couldn't reach. Relocation assistance appeared as a grant from a foundation that actually existed, distributed through a caseworker who had no idea her operating budget had been quietly supplemented by money that would never appear on any audit trail. Woo Hyun watched it unfold through reports that arrived encrypted on devices that would be destroyed after reading. He saw Nia's cautious hope in the way she researched the organization, verified the job offer's legitimacy, investigated the apartment's authenticity. She was too smart to trust luck. But she was also exhausted enough to need it to be real. On the morning they left, Woo Hyun stood in a building across from her apartment, watching through windows tinted dark enough to hide him. Nia carried 2 suitcases, everything they owned compressed into luggage light enough for one woman to manage alone. Eli held a backpack decorated with cartoon characters, his expression serious. Understanding this was significant even if he didn't know why. The car service arrived on time. Professional. Clean. The driver helped with bags without asking questions, treated them with the careful courtesy that came from being paid well enough to mind his own business. Woo Hyun watched them drive away, and felt something break that he hadn't known could still fracture. The protection continued from distance. Security teams in Portland who didn't know what they were protecting, only that someone was paying exceptional money for them to notice patterns and report anomalies. Monitoring of databases that might flag Nia's name or Eli's information. Quiet intervention when Minsuk's inquiries started approaching dangerous proximity. Contractors who suddenly lost interest in their assignments. Surveillance footage that mysteriously corrupted. Leads that evaporated before conclusions could form. Woo Hyun spent more money keeping them invisible than most men spent building empires. And never once considered it wasteful. He received updates monthly. Photographs taken from long range, school records obtained through channels that left no trace, medical records that confirmed Eli was healthy, growing, thriving in ways that poverty had made difficult. The boy smiled more in Portland, played in parks without Nia's hand gripping his shoulder like armor, looked like a child who believed the world was safe enough to explore. Woo Hyun kept one photograph on his phone, hidden in a folder labeled with random characters that meant nothing to anyone searching. Eli at a playground, arms spread wide on a swing, mouth open in laughter. The autumn sun catching his face in profile. His son. Unknown. Unacknowledged. Unreachable. Protected. One night, Jin Ho asked the question he'd been holding for months. Will you ever tell him? Woo Hyun looked at the man who'd protected him for 11 years. Who'd earned the right to ask questions that others wouldn't dare voice. No, he said simply. Why not? Because the moment I claim him, I make him what I am. Woo Hyun's voice was steady, carved from decisions that couldn't be unmade. And what I am gets people killed. Jin Ho nodded slowly, understanding the mathematics of sacrifice that had no formula for redemption. Then what are you? He asked quietly. Woo Hyun looked at the photograph of his son laughing on a swing, 3,000 miles away, safe in the kind of anonymity that power couldn't purchase but powerlessness could provide. A man who loves his son enough to let him believe I don't exist. Fatherhood, he'd learned, wasn't about legacy or recognition or the transfer of names and empires. It was about the things you didn't take, the claims you didn't make, the love that survived without ever being spoken. 3 years passed. Woo Hyun built his empire higher, consolidated power with the methodical precision that had always defined him, eliminated threats before they fully materialized. To the outside world, he remained exactly what he'd always been. Untouchable, disciplined. A man whose control extended so completely that even his silences carried authority. But Jin Ho noticed the changes. The way Woo Hyun refused certain contracts, operations that involved children, neighborhoods where schools operated, territories that would require violence near playgrounds. Refusals he never explained, decisions that seemed arbitrary unless you understood they followed a moral boundary that hadn't existed before. The way he liquidated assets in industries that exploited desperation, predatory lending operations, trafficking networks adjacent to his organization, businesses that profited from the same poverty Nia had weaponized for protection. The way he watched footage of Eli, now 10 years old, taller, his face losing its childhood roundness, with an expression that looked like grief wearing the mask of discipline. Late one night, alone in his office, Woo Hyun allowed himself to imagine the future he'd prevented. Eli at 15, being groomed for succession by men who understood loyalty as transactional and family as strategic advantage. Learning to read violence before reading poetry. Developing the kind of emotional armor that turned children into weapons and weapons into men who couldn't remember what they'd been before. Eli at 25, sitting in the same office, making the same calculations, ordering the same violence, perpetuating the same cycle that had consumed Woo Hyun's humanity one compromise at a time. Eli at 40, alone and powerful, looking at photographs of a son he'd abandoned for reasons that sounded like protection but felt like cowardice. The vision broke something Woo Hyun hadn't known was still intact. He'd spent 20 years building an empire, and the only legacy that mattered was making sure his son never inherited it. Min-suk made his move on a Thursday in October. It was subtle, a question raised in a meeting about succession planning, a casual observation that Woo Hyun had no clear heir, a suggestion that organizations without continuity plans invited instability. The other lieutenants shifted uncomfortably. Succession was a topic everyone thought about, but nobody mentioned in the presence of men still occupying thrones. Woo Hyun let the silence extend until it became uncomfortable. Then he spoke with the calm finality of pronouncements that didn't invite debate. I have no heir. I don't want one. When I'm gone, this organization dissolves or transforms into something else. That's the plan. Min Suk's expression flickered. Surprise, confusion, recalculation. That's unusual, he said carefully. So is living past 50 in this business, Woo Hyun replied. I'm choosing the unusual option. It wasn't an explanation. It was a commandment. The meeting ended with the tension of men who'd just witnessed something they couldn't interpret. A king rejecting the principle of kingdoms. A father denying the logic of dynasties. Later, Jin Ho asked what everyone was thinking. You're really going to let it all end with you? Yes. Why? Woo Hyun looked at his most loyal soldier. The man who'd protected him through wars that left bodies uncounted and betrayals that rewrote organizational charts overnight. Because the best thing I can give my son is a world where my name means nothing to him. In Portland, Eli turned 10 with a birthday party in a park, surrounded by friends whose parents didn't check their children for weapons before they left the house. Nia had built a life there, a real one with roots that went deeper than survival. She'd been promoted at work, started dating a teacher who made her laugh and didn't ask about the past she never discussed, began to believe in futures that didn't require constant vigilance. Woo Hyun watched from 3,000 miles away, through photographs and reports that arrived encrypted and were destroyed after reading. His son blowing out candles on a cake decorated with soccer balls. His son's report card showing grades that reflected safety and stability. His son's smile, unburdened by inheritance, unmarked by violence, innocent in ways that men like Woo Hyun could never be again. And he understood. This was fatherhood. Not the moment of recognition. Not the pride of legacy transferred. Not the comfort of being known. But the daily, invisible sacrifice of ensuring someone you loved never had to become what you were. Years later, when Woo Hyun was asked if he had children, he said no. The lie came easily. It was the last protection he could offer, the erasure of connection, the severing of lineage, the guarantee that